The morning sun cast long shadows across the outdoor shooting range as Marcus Chen adjusted the final target stand at the 200-yard line. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, checking each mounting bolt and ensuring the paper targets hung perfectly straight. The quiet satisfaction he found in this work had become his anchor over the past 3 years, a simple routine that kept the chaos of his thoughts at bay. Behind him, the range was already coming alive with the weekend crowd. Expensive SUVs pulled into the gravel parking lot, their occupants emerging with custom rifle cases and designer shooting gear. Marcus had learned to recognize the types: the recreational marksmen who treated the range like a country club, the serious competitors who came early to avoid the crowds, and the occasional veteran like himself who found solace in the familiar weight of a rifle and the distant ping of metal targets. He glanced back toward the main building where 80-year-old Emma sat at the reception desk, her dark hair falling over her homework as she worked through multiplication tables. The sight of her there, so focused and determined despite everything they had been through, sent a familiar ache through his chest. She had insisted on coming with him today, claiming she wanted to finish her math assignment in quiet, but Marcus knew the real reason. Emma worried about him when they were apart, the same way he worried about her medical appointments and the bills that kept arriving in their mailbox. The first shooters of the day were setting up at the nearby benches, their conversations carrying across the morning air. Marcus recognized most of them by now, weekend warriors who came to play soldier for a few hours before returning to their comfortable lives. He had no judgment for them, everyone needed their escape, but sometimes their casual discussions about tactical gear and military tactics made something twist in his stomach. Emma looked up from her homework and waved at him through the window. Marcus raised his hand in return, noting how the morning light caught the delicate features that reminded him so much of Sarah, his late wife. 3 years since the accident, and some days it still felt impossible that she was gone. Emma had been 5 then, too young to fully understand why Daddy cried at night and why they had to move from their house on base to the small apartment in town. A car door slammed in the parking lot, followed by loud laughter and the clink of beer bottles. Marcus frowned slightly as he watched a group of 4 men unload their gear. It was barely 9 in the morning, and while the range allowed alcohol after shooting was complete, some people seemed to interpret that rule creatively. The man leading the group wore expensive tactical clothing that had never seen real action, his movements broadcasting the kind of confidence that came from money rather than experience. Marcus returned his attention to the targets, walking the line to ensure everything was secure. This was his domain during operating hours, maintaining the equipment and keeping the range safe for everyone who used it. Commander Walsh, the range owner, had been clear about his responsibilities when she hired him. She was former Navy herself, a retired SEAL who understood that some veterans needed work that kept their hands busy and their minds focused. The job paid enough to cover their basic expenses, though it left little room for extras. Emma's upcoming specialist appointment weighed heavily on his mind, the consultation fee alone would strain their budget for months. But she needed to see the doctor about her hearing, the tests that might determine whether her recent struggles in school were related to the ear infections she had suffered as a toddler. Marcus checked his watch and began the walk back toward the main building. In a few minutes, Commander Walsh would arrive for the morning briefing, and the range would officially open for business. The weekend crowds always brought their own challenges, more people meant more opportunities for accidents or conflicts, and Marcus had learned to stay alert for potential problems. As he approached the building, he could see Emma had abandoned her homework in favor of watching the early arrivals through the window. Her expression was thoughtful, the way it got when she was trying to figure something out. At 8 years old, she had already developed an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that sometimes made Marcus wonder what kind of childhood he was giving her. The radio on his belt crackled to life. Commander Walsh's voice came through clear and professional. She would be arriving in 10 minutes and wanted a status report on range conditions. Marcus responded with his usual efficiency, confirming that all targets were set and safety equipment was in place. He had learned to appreciate Walsh's military precision, the way she ran the facility with clear expectations and mutual respect. The weekend crowd was growing larger now, and Marcus could already identify the groups that might require extra attention. The loud men who had arrived earlier were setting up at the far end of the range, their gear spread across multiple shooting benches despite range etiquette. Their leader, the man in the expensive tactical clothing, was holding court with his companions, his voice carrying across the morning air as he critiqued the range facilities. Emma appeared at the door of the main building, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Marcus walked over to meet her, noting the slight furrow in her brow that meant she had something on her mind. She had inherited his tendency to observe and analyze, though at her age it manifested as an endless stream of questions about the world around her. "Dad," she said quietly, "why do some people act like they know everything about guns when they have never been in the military?" The question caught Marcus off guard, both for its perceptiveness and its timing. He knelt down to her level, considering how to answer without revealing too much of his own complicated relationship with civilian shooters. "People find confidence in different ways, sweetheart," he replied finally. "Some people have earned their knowledge through experience, and others are still learning. The important thing is to always be safe and respectful, no matter how much or how little you know." Emma nodded seriously, filing this information away with the same intensity she brought to her homework. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced Commander Walsh's arrival. Marcus straightened up, automatically adjusting his posture in response to her presence. Even in civilian clothes, Walsh carried herself with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in dangerous places. She emerged from her pickup truck with the efficient movements of someone who wasted neither time nor energy. "Where in the world are you watching from right now?" Marcus wondered silently as he observed the growing crowd of weekend shooters. Emma tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward the parking lot where more vehicles were arriving. The day was shaping up to be busy, and something in the air suggested it might be more complicated than usual. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts about such things, the same sixth sense that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. Commander Walsh approached with her usual purposeful stride, her eyes automatically scanning the range conditions as she walked. Marcus fell into step beside her, ready to begin another day of maintaining order in a world that sometimes felt balanced on the edge of chaos. Emma waved goodbye from the doorway, her homework temporarily forgotten as she prepared to spend the morning reading in the office. The morning was still young, and already Marcus could sense the undercurrents that would shape the hours ahead. The loud group at the far end of the range, Commander Walsh's arrival, and Emma's perceptive questions all felt like pieces of a puzzle he had not yet learned to solve. But for now, there was work to do, targets to maintain, and safety to ensure. The rest would unfold in its own time, the way it always did in places where precision mattered and respect was earned rather than assumed. The roar of a diesel engine cut through the morning calm as a black lifted pickup truck pulled into the parking lot with unnecessary aggression. Marcus watched from his position near the target line as the driver parked diagonally across two spaces, the oversized tires crunching gravel as if making a statement about ownership of the space. Brad Morrison emerged from the driver's seat like a man accustomed to commanding attention. His tactical clothing bore the telltale signs of expensive gear that had never seen real action, every piece of equipment perfectly clean and strategically positioned for maximum visual impact. The three men who climbed out of the passenger side moved with the deference of an entourage, their body language suggesting they were more audience than equals. Marcus continued his methodical check of the target stands, but his peripheral vision tracked the new arrivals as they unloaded their equipment. Years of military training had taught him to assess potential threats without appearing to watch, and something about Morrison's demeanor triggered old instincts. The man moved with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Morrison's voice carried across the range as he critiqued the facility layout, his tone suggesting he found the entire operation beneath his standards. His companions nodded along with his observations, occasionally adding their own comments in voices carefully pitched to avoid overshadowing their leader. Marcus recognized the dynamic immediately, the alpha and his followers, common in civilian shooting circles where actual combat experience was rare. Commander Walsh finished her inspection of the main building and approached Marcus with her usual efficient stride. Her eyes automatically catalogued the new arrivals, the same threat assessment Marcus had performed moments earlier. 20 years in special operations had given her the same unconscious habits, the constant evaluation of people and situations that had kept her alive in hostile territory. "Everything looked good this morning, Chen," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that came naturally to former officers. Marcus nodded his confirmation, though both of them had noticed Morrison's group setting up their equipment with obvious disregard for range etiquette. Multiple rifles were being assembled simultaneously across several shooting benches, creating a sprawling command post that encroached on spaces reserved for other shooters. Morrison caught sight of Marcus and Walsh talking near the target line. His expression shifted to the predatory interest of someone who enjoyed asserting dominance over perceived subordinates. He strode toward them with the swagger of a man who had never met a situation he could not purchase his way out of, his tactical boots crunching gravel with each deliberate step. "Excuse me," Morrison called out when he was still several yards away, his tone managing to sound both polite and condescending simultaneously. "You must be the range staff. I need to discuss some issues with your target setup." The way he addressed both Marcus and Walsh made it clear he assumed they were interchangeable employees rather than the owner and her maintenance supervisor. Commander Walsh stepped forward slightly, her military bearing becoming more pronounced as she sized up the approaching civilian. Marcus remained at her shoulder, his own posture unconsciously shifting into the alert stance that had once been second nature during patrol operations. Morrison seemed oblivious to the subtle change in atmosphere, his attention focused on what he perceived as an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. "I am Commander Walsh, owner of this facility," she replied evenly. "What seems to be the problem?" Morrison's expression flickered with surprise at encountering actual authority, but he recovered quickly and launched into a detailed critique of the target distances and positioning. His complaints revealed more about his own shooting limitations than any actual deficiencies in the range setup. Marcus listened to the exchange while continuing his visual sweep of the facility. Emma was visible through the office window, her homework spread across the reception desk as she worked with the focused concentration that always made his chest tighten with pride. She had developed the ability to tune out the background noise of the shooting range, a skill that sometimes worried him given her recent hearing difficulties. Morrison's voice grew more animated as he warmed to his subject, his gestures becoming broader as he explained how a properly run facility should operate. His companions had spread out across their claimed territory, assembling an impressive array of firearms and accessories that probably cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months. The display was clearly intended to intimidate and impress, though it had the opposite effect on anyone with actual military experience. "The range is set up according to standard specifications," Commander Walsh replied calmly when Morrison paused for breath. "If you have specific concerns about safety or operations, would be happy to address them." Her tone remained professional, but Marcus caught the slight edge that suggested her patience was not unlimited. Morrison seemed to interpret her response as submission rather than restraint. He turned his attention to Marcus with the casual dismissal he might show a piece of equipment. "You there," he said, pointing at Marcus as if summoning a waiter. "I need you to reset all the targets at the 200-yard line. The current setup is completely inadequate for serious shooting." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his jaw that came with swallowing words that wanted to be spoken. 3 years of civilian employment had taught him the value of choosing his battles carefully, especially when Emma's security depended on his steady paycheck. He glanced at Commander Walsh, who gave an almost imperceptible nod indicating he should comply with the request. "Certainly, sir," Marcus replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the irritation that churned beneath the surface. As he turned toward the target line, he caught Morrison's satisfied smirk in his peripheral vision. The man clearly enjoyed the power dynamic he had established, the civilian authority over the former soldier who now worked with his hands for hourly wages. The walk to the target line gave Marcus time to center himself, drawing on the emotional discipline that had carried him through deployments in hostile territory. Emma's medical bills, their small apartment, the routine that kept their lives stable, all of it depended on his ability to maintain professional composure regardless of personal provocation. Behind him, Morrison continued his lecture to Commander Walsh, his voice growing more confident as he mistook her silence for agreement. Marcus began the process of adjusting the target stands, his movements precise and efficient despite the unnecessary nature of the task. The work kept his hands busy while his mind processed the dynamics developing around him. Morrison's group had attracted the attention of other shooters, some drawn by curiosity and others by the expensive equipment on display. The morning crowd was growing larger, and Marcus could sense the subtle shift in atmosphere that came when personalities began to clash. He had learned to recognize the signs during his years maintaining the range, the tension that built when egos collided in spaces where firearms were present. Emma appeared at the office window again, her homework apparently complete. She waved at Marcus, who raised his hand in acknowledgement while continuing his work with the targets. The sight of her watching gave him the strength to maintain his professional demeanor, knowing that her stability depended on his ability to navigate these situations without losing his temper or his job. The crack of rifle fire began to echo across the range as Morrison's group settled into their shooting positions. Marcus completed his adjustments to the target stands, each movement deliberate and precise despite knowing the changes were unnecessary. Years of military discipline had taught him that excellence in small tasks built the foundation for success in larger missions, even when those missions involved swallowing pride for a steady paycheck. Morrison positioned himself at the center shooting bench like a general surveying his battlefield. His rifle was an expensive precision instrument, probably worth more than Marcus earned in 3 months, but money could not purchase the muscle memory and breathing control that separated recreational shooters from combat marksmen. Marcus watched from the target line as Morrison struggled with basic fundamentals, his shots grouping poorly despite optimal conditions. The first volley of complaints began before Morrison had fired 10 rounds. The targets were positioned incorrectly, he announced loudly enough for everyone on the range to hear. The wind flags were inadequate for serious precision work. The shooting benches were not properly leveled. Each criticism was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for actual results under pressure. Marcus walked back toward the main building, passing close enough to Morrison's position to observe the man's technique. The rifle scope was clearly beyond Morrison's skill level, a high magnification optic that amplified every tremor and breathing error rather than compensating for them. His shooting position was textbook amateur, all tension and force where relaxation and natural point of aim should dominate. Commander Walsh emerged from the office with a clipboard, her eyes automatically scanning the range for safety violations or developing problems. Marcus fell into step beside her, both of them maintaining the professional distance that came naturally to former military personnel in civilian settings. They had learned to communicate with glances and subtle gestures, conserving words for when they were truly necessary. Morrison's voice rose above the general noise of the range as he berated one of his companions for allegedly disturbing his concentration. The man's frustration was becoming more visible with each poor shot group, his expensive equipment failing to deliver the results his ego demanded. Marcus recognized the pattern from previous encounters with weekend warriors who confused spending money with developing skill. The shooting community began to take notice of Morrison's increasingly vocal dissatisfaction. Other marksmen paused their own activities to watch the drama unfolding at the far end of the range, some with amusement and others with the second-hand embarrassment that came from witnessing someone publicly struggle with tasks they claimed to master. Marcus had seen this dynamic play out dozens of times during his years maintaining the facility. Emma appeared at his side with the quiet suddenness that had become her trademark. She moved through the world with an awareness that seemed advanced for her 8 years, perhaps developed through the necessity of reading her father's moods and the subtle tensions that surrounded their daily life. Her presence always grounded Marcus, reminding him of what truly mattered beyond the petty conflicts that consumed other people's energy. "Dad," she said quietly, "is that man angry because he cannot hit the targets?" Her observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that children brought to adult situations, cutting through layers of complexity to identify the essential truth. Marcus glanced down at her, noting how she had positioned herself to observe Morrison's group while remaining safely behind the firing line. "Some people get frustrated when things do not go the way they expect, sweetheart," Marcus replied carefully. "It is important to stay calm and keep practicing, rather than blaming other people or equipment when we make mistakes." Emma nodded solemnly, filing this lesson away with the practical wisdom she had been accumulating since her mother's death. Morrison's latest string of poor shots triggered another round of equipment criticism. He stood up from his shooting position with obvious agitation, his voice carrying across the range as he detailed the supposed deficiencies in the facility's setup. His companions exchanged glances that suggested they had witnessed similar performances in other venues, though none of them possessed the courage to contradict their leader's assessment. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest as memories threatened to surface unbidden. The feeling of watching rounds impact precisely where intended, the zen-like focus that came with perfect breathing control and natural point of aim, the absolute confidence that came from thousands of hours of training under conditions far more challenging than any civilian range could simulate. He pushed the thoughts down, focusing instead on Emma's steady presence at his side. Commander Walsh approached Morrison's position with the measured stride of someone preparing to address a developing situation. Her military bearing became more pronounced as she closed the distance, her posture conveying authority without aggression. Marcus watched the interaction from a distance, knowing that Walsh was one of the few people on the range qualified to evaluate Morrison's claims about facility deficiencies. The conversation between Walsh and Morrison began cordially enough, but Marcus could see the tension building in the commander's shoulders as the civilian continued his litany of complaints. Morrison seemed to interpret her professional courtesy as validation of his criticisms, his voice growing more confident as he detailed how a properly managed facility should operate according to his extensive theoretical knowledge. Emma tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve, drawing his attention back to her upturned face. Her expression was thoughtful in the way that meant she was processing information beyond her years, trying to understand adult dynamics that did not always follow logical patterns. Marcus wondered sometimes what kind of lessons she was learning from their daily exposure to the shooting range community. "Why do some people talk so much about things they are not very good at?" she asked with the devastating honesty that only children could deliver. Marcus felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth despite the tension surrounding Morrison's performance. Emma had identified the core contradiction that many adults spent considerable energy avoiding or explaining away. Before Marcus could formulate an appropriate response, Morrison's voice rose to a level that commanded attention from everyone on the range. He was now directly challenging Commander Walsh's competence as a facility operator, his frustration with his own poor shooting having evolved into an attack on everyone and everything around him. The morning was developing exactly as Marcus's instincts had predicted when he first observed Morrison's arrival. The range fell silent except for Morrison's voice as other shooters paused their activities to witness the confrontation. Marcus instinctively moved closer to Emma, his protective instincts activated by the escalating tension and the presence of multiple loaded firearms in an emotionally charged environment. Years of combat experience had taught him that pride and weapons made a dangerous combination when supervision and discipline were absent. Commander Walsh's response was measured and professional, but Marcus could see the steel beneath her diplomatic words. She had commanded men and women in life-or-death situations where competence was measured by survival rather than opinion, and Morrison's civilian arrogance was testing the limits of her patience. The morning that had begun with routine maintenance was evolving into something that would test everyone's ability to maintain composure under pressure. The rumble of another vehicle in the parking lot drew Marcus's attention away from Morrison's escalating confrontation with Commander Walsh. A weathered Ford pickup pulled into the lot with the understated efficiency that marked its driver as someone who chose function over appearance. Marcus recognized the truck immediately, and felt something ease in his chest as Commander Sarah Walsh stepped out of the passenger side. Marcus realized his mistake immediately. The woman emerging from the Ford was not Commander Walsh, but someone who carried herself with the same unmistakable bearing that came from years of military command. This was a different kind of authority, one earned in places where leadership meant the difference between mission success and body bags. She moved with the economic grace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. Commander Sarah Walsh, retired Navy SEAL, approached the range with the measured stride of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. Her civilian clothes could not disguise the physical conditioning that came from decades of elite military service, nor the alert eyes that automatically catalogued potential threats and tactical advantages. Marcus had heard stories about her legendary career, whispered with the reverence that combat veterans reserved for those who had earned their respect in blood and fire. Morrison's voice faltered slightly as Walsh approached his position, some primal instinct recognizing the presence of genuine authority despite his civilian arrogance. His companions seemed to sense the shift in dynamics as well, their postures subtly changing from relaxed observation to nervous attention. The range fell silent except for the distant crack of rifles from other shooting positions. Marcus watched the interaction unfold with the professional interest of someone who had learned to read people and situations under pressure. Commander Walsh moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had faced down enemies in places where hesitation meant death. Morrison's bluster seemed suddenly inadequate when confronted with the real thing, though his ego prevented him from recognizing the depth of his disadvantage. Emma stepped closer to Marcus, her young instincts picking up on the tension that radiated from the gathering crowd of observers. She had developed an uncanny ability to sense when adult situations were moving beyond her understanding, though she remained curious about the dynamics she could not yet fully comprehend. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture of protection and reassurance. "Good morning," Commander Walsh said to Morrison, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous places on Earth. "I understand there are some concerns about range operations." Morrison straightened unconsciously, his body responding to the unmistakable presence of someone who had earned the right to give orders to people much more dangerous than weekend recreational shooters. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in controlled confrontation. Morrison attempted to maintain his aggressive stance, but Commander Walsh's questions revealed the shallow nature of his expertise with surgical precision. She asked about his military experience, his formal training, his familiarity with precision shooting under adverse conditions. Each inquiry stripped away another layer of Morrison's assumed authority. Marcus found himself admiring the commander's technique as she systematically dismantled Morrison's credibility without raising her voice or displaying obvious aggression. This was how real professionals handled conflicts, with intelligence and discipline rather than emotion and volume. Morrison's companions began to distance themselves physically from their leader as his claims crumbled under expert scrutiny. The morning sun climbed higher as the confrontation continued, casting harsh shadows across the shooting benches where Morrison's expensive equipment lay abandoned. Other range users had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the drama but wise enough to avoid interfering with what was clearly becoming a lesson in authentic versus assumed authority. Marcus noted how many of them were veterans themselves, recognizing Commander Walsh's bearing even if they did not know her specific credentials. Emma tugged gently on Marcus's shirt, her signal that she had a question that could not wait for a more convenient moment. "Dad," she whispered, "why does that lady make the loud man seem smaller?" Her observation cut to the heart of what everyone was witnessing, the way genuine competence could reduce bombast to its proper insignificant proportions. "Real strength does not need to shout, sweetheart," Marcus replied quietly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. Emma nodded thoughtfully, adding this lesson to her growing understanding of how adults navigated the complex world of power and respect. Marcus wondered sometimes if he was giving her too much exposure to these dynamics, but their circumstances left few alternatives. Commander Walsh's interrogation of Morrison reached its inevitable conclusion as his claims of expertise evaporated under professional scrutiny. The man who had arrived with such confidence now stood exposed as exactly what Marcus had recognized from the beginning, a civilian playing soldier with expensive toys and borrowed authority. The commander's dismissal was polite but final, leaving Morrison with no graceful exit from his own performance. The aftermath of Morrison's humiliation should have ended the morning's drama, but Marcus sensed that wounded pride often led to escalated stupidity rather than graceful retreat. Morrison's face showed the red flush of someone who had never experienced real consequences for his arrogance, and his eyes held the dangerous glitter of a man planning to salvage his reputation through increasingly desperate measures. Marcus moved Emma slightly behind him, positioning himself between his daughter and the developing situation. Years of combat experience had taught him that embarrassed men with access to firearms represented a particular category of threat, one that required careful monitoring and rapid response if necessary. Commander Walsh seemed to share his assessment, her posture shifting subtly from instructional to tactical. The range community continued to watch the unfolding drama with the fascinated attention that came from witnessing someone dig their own grave with impressive determination. Morrison's companions had abandoned any pretense of supporting their leader, their body language suggesting they were reconsidering their association with someone whose judgment had proven so spectacularly flawed. Morrison's next words would determine whether the morning ended with wounded pride or something more dangerous. Marcus felt his old instincts awakening, the hyper-awareness that had kept him alive in places where threats could materialize from any direction without warning. Commander Walsh's presence provided reassurance, but also suggested that the situation was developing beyond simple civilian drama into something that might require more serious intervention. The sun reached its zenith as the confrontation entered its next phase, casting everything in stark clarity that left no room for ambiguity or misunderstanding. Marcus held Emma close while maintaining his observation of Morrison, whose next decision would reveal whether he possessed enough wisdom to recognize when he was overmatched, or enough foolishness to escalate a situation he could never win against opponents whose qualifications were earned rather than purchased. Morrison's face cycled through several shades of red as Commander Walsh's systematic dismantling of his credentials reached its conclusion. The gathered crowd of range users had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of watching someone's carefully constructed persona collapse under professional scrutiny. Marcus recognized the dangerous moment when wounded pride typically transformed into reckless action, and he instinctively shifted his position to keep Emma shielded from whatever escalation might follow. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Morrison struggled to formulate a response that might salvage some fragment of his damaged reputation. His expensive tactical gear now seemed like costume jewelry, impressive from a distance but revealed as fake when examined by genuine experts. His companions had continued their strategic withdrawal, creating physical and social distance from their former leader's humiliation. Commander Walsh waited with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to letting others reveal their character through their choices. Her military bearing remained unchanged, neither gloating over Morrison's exposure nor offering him any face-saving exit from the situation he had created. This was how real professionals handled confrontation, with competence rather than cruelty, though the result was often more devastating than any emotional outburst. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his as she sensed the adult tension that filled the morning air like static electricity before a thunderstorm. At 8 years old, she had already learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when grown-up situations were moving beyond normal boundaries. Her presence served as both anchor and reminder of what truly mattered beyond the ego conflicts that consumed other people's energy. Morrison finally found his voice, though it emerged higher and more strained than his earlier bombast. "Since everyone seems to think they know so much about shooting," he announced loudly, "maybe we should have a little demonstration." He gestured toward the distant targets with the theatrical flair of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had already moved beyond his influence. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a discharged rifle, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple marksmanship. Marcus understood immediately that Morrison was attempting to shift the conflict from credentials to performance, hoping that his expensive equipment might compensate for his lack of authentic experience. It was the desperate gambit of someone who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. Commander Walsh's expression remained neutral, though Marcus caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was evaluating multiple tactical considerations simultaneously. The range had become a stage where Morrison was demanding a performance that could easily escalate beyond safe boundaries, especially given his demonstrated lack of judgment and emotional control. "What exactly are you proposing?" Commander Walsh asked with the careful tone of someone who had learned to let others define the scope of their own destruction. Morrison's answer revealed the full extent of his desperation as he outlined a shooting challenge that would supposedly prove who possessed real expertise versus theoretical knowledge. The crowd of observers responded with the mixture of excitement and apprehension that came from witnessing someone make spectacularly poor decisions in public. Marcus recognized several veterans among the gathered shooters, their expressions reflecting the same professional assessment he was conducting. Morrison was proposing a contest he could not win against opponents he could not recognize. Emma looked up at Marcus with the questioning expression that meant she was trying to understand adult behavior that defied logical explanation. "Dad," she whispered, "why does that man want to do something he is not good at?" Her question captured the essential absurdity of Morrison's position with the clarity that only children could bring to adult foolishness. "Sometimes people make bad choices when they are embarrassed," Marcus replied quietly, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed similar dynamics in much more dangerous contexts. Emma nodded solemnly, filing this observation away with her growing collection of insights about human nature and the consequences of poor judgment. What would you do in Marcus's situation? He found himself wondering as Morrison continued to elaborate his challenge with increasing grandiosity. The man was clearly setting himself up for further humiliation, but the presence of loaded firearms and wounded pride created variables that extended beyond simple entertainment. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts about when situations might spiral beyond civilian boundaries into something requiring military responses. Commander Walsh's silence stretched longer as she considered Morrison's proposal, her tactical mind probably calculating risks and benefits with the same systematic approach she had once applied to mission planning in hostile territory. The range had become a classroom where Morrison was about to receive an education in the difference between purchased equipment and earned expertise. Morrison's companions had completed their retreat to safe distances, their body language suggesting they had finally recognized the magnitude of their leader's tactical error. Other range users continued to gather, drawn by the spectacle but maintaining the respectful distance that experienced shooters showed when witnessing potentially dangerous demonstrations of poor judgment. The morning sun had reached its full intensity, casting everything in sharp relief that eliminated shadows and ambiguity. Marcus felt the familiar heightening of awareness that came when situations moved beyond routine into territory where training and instinct became primary survival tools. Emma's presence kept him grounded in the present moment, even as his mind automatically began calculating angles and escape routes. Morrison's voice grew more strident as he attempted to pressure Commander Walsh into accepting his challenge, apparently unaware that he was demanding a demonstration from someone whose credentials were earned in places where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. The irony was lost on him, but clearly visible to everyone else who possessed the experience to recognize authentic authority. Commander Walsh finally spoke, her words carrying the weight of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure that Morrison could never imagine. "If you insist on a demonstration," she said calmly, "we should establish clear parameters and safety protocols." Morrison's eager agreement revealed that he still failed to understand the depth of his disadvantage. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the developing challenge while maintaining the ability to protect Emma if Morrison's poor judgment extended to unsafe handling of firearms. The morning that had begun with routine target maintenance was evolving into something that would test everyone's ability to maintain professional standards in the face of civilian arrogance and wounded pride. The range community settled into observation positions as Morrison began preparing for a contest that would inevitably expose the difference between expensive equipment and authentic expertise. Marcus felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and concern that came from watching someone walk confidently toward their own destruction, while hoping that collateral damage could be minimized through careful management of an increasingly volatile situation. The atmosphere on the range shifted as Morrison's challenge took concrete form. He strode toward his shooting position with renewed confidence, apparently believing that his expensive equipment would compensate for the credibility he had lost during Commander Walsh's interrogation. His movements carried the forced bravado of someone who had never learned to recognize when retreat was the wisest tactical option. Marcus watched the preparations with the professional detachment that came from years of observing human behavior under stress. Morrison was setting himself up for spectacular failure, but wounded pride often led to escalated stupidity rather than graceful acceptance of reality. The presence of loaded firearms and gathered spectators created additional variables that required careful monitoring. Commander Walsh positioned herself at a safe observation distance, her military bearing unchanged despite Morrison's theatrical preparations. Her expression remained neutral, though Marcus caught the slight set to her shoulders that suggested she was calculating multiple contingencies simultaneously. Years of special operations had taught her to prepare for situations to evolve beyond their apparent boundaries. Morrison's companions had completed their strategic withdrawal to positions that provided clear views of the developing spectacle while maintaining plausible deniability about their association with their former leader. Their body language suggested they had finally recognized the magnitude of Morrison's tactical error, though none possessed the courage to intervene before he completed his public humiliation. The crowd of range users continued to grow as word spread about the confrontation unfolding at the far end of the facility. Marcus recognized several veterans among the observers, their expressions reflecting the same mixture of professional interest and concern he was feeling. Morrison was about to receive an education in the difference between purchased equipment and earned expertise. Emma remained close to Marcus's side, her young instincts keeping her anchored to the one person she trusted completely in an environment filled with adult tensions she could not fully understand. Her presence served as both comfort and responsibility, reminding Marcus that his primary mission was her safety regardless of whatever drama was unfolding around them. Morrison began his shooting demonstration with the theatrical flair of someone who confused performance with competence. His expensive rifle was indeed impressive, probably capable of precision that exceeded the shooter's ability to utilize it effectively. The scope alone cost more than Marcus earned in 2 months, though money could not purchase the muscle memory and breathing control that separated recreational shooters from combat marksmen. The first few shots revealed immediately that Morrison's equipment far exceeded his skill level. His groups scattered across the target face with the random pattern that indicated fundamental problems with shooting position, breathing, and trigger control. The expensive optics amplified every tremor and breathing error rather than compensating for them, creating a magnified display of his inadequacies. Morrison's frustration became visible with each poor shot, his voice rising as he blamed wind conditions, equipment malfunctions, and target positioning for results that clearly reflected his own limitations. The gathered crowd watched with the fascinated attention that came from witnessing someone dig their own grave with impressive determination and expensive tools. Commander Walsh observed the demonstration with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to let others reveal their character through their choices. Her silence was more devastating than any verbal critique could have been, allowing Morrison's performance to speak for itself without commentary or interpretation. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest as memories threatened to surface unbidden. The sensation of perfect sight alignment, the natural respiratory pause between heartbeats, the smooth press of a trigger that broke like glass under controlled pressure. He pushed the thoughts down, focusing instead on Emma's steady presence and the developing situation that required his full attention. Morrison's shooting session deteriorated rapidly as his emotional state affected his already marginal technique. The expensive rifle seemed to rebel against his increasingly desperate efforts to force acceptable results through willpower rather than skill. His shot spread wider across the target face, creating a pattern that would have been embarrassing for a novice shooter, much less someone who had proclaimed expert credentials. The crowd began to stir restlessly as Morrison's demonstration extended beyond entertainment into something approaching cruelty. Several observers exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing someone's public breakdown rather than a legitimate display of marksmanship. Marcus noted how many veterans in the crowd were shifting uncomfortably, their professional instincts recognizing a situation that was moving beyond normal boundaries. Morrison finally abandoned his shooting position with obvious agitation, his face flushed with the combination of physical exertion and emotional frustration that came from public failure. His expensive equipment lay scattered across multiple shooting benches like the remnants of a defeated army, impressive in isolation but revealed as inadequate when confronted with the demands of actual performance. The silence that followed Morrison's demonstration carried the weight of collective embarrassment as the gathered crowd processed what they had witnessed. Commander Walsh maintained her neutral expression, though Marcus caught the slight relaxation in her posture that suggested the immediate danger had passed. Morrison had humiliated himself more thoroughly than any opponent could have managed. But Marcus's combat instincts warned him that the situation was far from resolved. Wounded pride often led to escalated poor judgment, and Morrison's eyes held the dangerous glitter of someone planning to salvage his reputation through increasingly desperate measures. The man who had arrived with such confidence now faced the choice between graceful retreat and doubling down on his already catastrophic tactical position. Morrison's gaze swept the assembled crowd until it settled on Marcus with the predatory focus of someone who had identified what he perceived as a softer target. The maintenance worker who had been quietly adjusting targets and following orders represented an opportunity to demonstrate dominance over someone who could not fight back without risking his employment. Marcus recognized the shift in Morrison's attention immediately, his own posture unconsciously adjusting as years of training activated in response to a developing threat. Emma moved closer to his side, her young instincts picking up on the change in adult dynamics even if she could not fully understand their implications. The morning sun continued its climb toward zenith as the confrontation entered its next phase. Morrison had failed to prove his superiority over Commander Walsh, but his wounded ego demanded satisfaction from someone. Marcus felt the familiar heightening of awareness that came when situations moved from observation to potential participation, while hoping that his professional discipline would be sufficient to protect both his job and his daughter's security. Morrison's attention fixed on Marcus with the calculating focus of a predator who had identified what appeared to be easier prey. The maintenance worker who had been quietly following orders and adjusting targets represented an opportunity to demonstrate authority over someone who could not fight back without risking his livelihood. Marcus recognized the shift immediately, his own awareness sharpening as years of combat training activated in response to a developing threat. The crowd sensed the change in dynamics as Morrison abandoned his shooting position and began walking toward Marcus with deliberate intent. His expensive equipment lay forgotten across the shooting benches, no longer relevant to a confrontation that had moved beyond marksmanship into something more personal and potentially dangerous. Commander Walsh tracked Morrison's movement with the alert stillness of someone calculating intervention options. Marcus instinctively positioned himself between Morrison and Emma, his protective instincts overriding all other considerations. 3 years of civilian employment had taught him to swallow pride and avoid confrontation, but his daughter's presence activated deeper programming that would not tolerate any perceived threat to her safety. Emma moved closer to his side, her young intuition recognizing the shift from adult drama to genuine danger. "You there," Morrison called out when he was still several yards away, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone trying to rebuild damaged credibility through intimidation. His approach was calculated to command attention from the gathered observers, a public demonstration of dominance over someone he assumed could not respond effectively. Marcus maintained his professional composure despite the familiar surge of adrenaline that came from being targeted by someone whose judgment had already proven spectacularly flawed. Years of military service had taught him to recognize various categories of threat, and Morrison represented the particularly dangerous combination of wounded pride, poor impulse control, and access to firearms. "I need you to personally verify that these targets are properly positioned," Morrison announced loudly enough for everyone on the range to hear. His tone carried the condescending authority he might use with a subordinate employee, apparently unaware that he was addressing someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. The gathered crowd watched with increasing tension as Morrison attempted to assert dominance over the quiet maintenance worker who had been professionally handling his earlier demands. Several veterans in the group exchanged glances that suggested they recognized something in Marcus's bearing that Morrison had failed to notice. Marcus nodded calmly in response to Morrison's demand, his voice remaining steady despite the provocation. "Certainly, sir, I will check the target positioning immediately." His professional response masked the rapid tactical assessment he was conducting, evaluating Morrison's emotional state and potential for escalation while calculating response options that would protect Emma. Morrison seemed to interpret Marcus's compliance as submission, his confidence growing as he sensed what he believed was an opportunity to salvage his reputation through the public humiliation of someone who could not fight back. His voice grew louder and more aggressive as he detailed supposed deficiencies in the target's setup that required immediate correction. Commander Walsh moved closer to the developing confrontation, her military bearing becoming more pronounced as she assessed the situation's potential for dangerous escalation. Marcus caught her eye briefly, a moment of silent communication between combat veterans who recognized each other despite different service branches and civilian circumstances. Emma tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve, her signal for a question that could not wait for a more convenient moment. "Dad," she whispered, "why is that man being mean to you when you are just doing your job?" Her innocent observation cut through the adult complexities to identify the essential injustice of Morrison's behavior. "Some people try to feel better about themselves by making others feel bad, sweetheart," Marcus replied quietly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. The lesson was one he hoped Emma would never need to apply in her own life, though experience had taught him that understanding human nature was essential for navigating a world that did not always operate according to fair principles. Morrison's demands became increasingly unreasonable as he warmed to his performance, apparently enjoying the sensation of exercising authority over someone he perceived as powerless to resist. He ordered Marcus to reset targets that were already properly positioned, critique equipment that was functioning perfectly, and explain procedures that needed no explanation. The crowd's discomfort became more visible as Morrison's behavior crossed from professional criticism into something approaching harassment. Several observers began to shift restlessly, their body language suggesting they were witnessing something that violated unspoken codes of conduct among the shooting community. Marcus complied with each demand while maintaining his professional demeanor, though the familiar tightness in his jaw indicated the effort required to suppress responses that would have been appropriate in military contexts but catastrophic in civilian employment. Emma's medical bills, their small apartment, the stability that depended on his steady paycheck, all of it required him to absorb Morrison's abuse without retaliation. Commander Walsh's patience appeared to be reaching its limits as Morrison's harassment of Marcus continued beyond reasonable boundaries. Her posture shifted subtly from observation to preparation, the change visible to anyone with military experience even if Morrison remained oblivious to the escalating danger of his position. Morrison's voice rose to a level that commanded attention from everyone on the range as he delivered what was clearly intended as a public humiliation of the maintenance worker who had dared to witness his earlier failure. His criticism became personal rather than professional, attacking Marcus's competence and questioning his right to work at a facility that served serious shooters. The morning sun had reached its peak intensity, casting harsh shadows that eliminated ambiguity and revealed character with unforgiving clarity. Marcus felt his old instincts fully awakening as Morrison's behavior moved beyond civilian harassment into territory that triggered defensive responses trained into him during years of combat deployment. Emma pressed closer to Marcus's side as Morrison's voice grew louder and more aggressive, her young survival instincts recognizing danger even if she could not fully understand its source. Marcus's protective programming engaged completely, overriding years of civilian conditioning as he prepared to respond to a threat that was targeting not just him but the safety of his daughter. Morrison made his final tactical error by stepping closer to Marcus while continuing his verbal assault, apparently unaware that he was moving within the reaction distance of someone whose reflexes had been honed by combat rather than recreational shooting. The maintenance worker he had been tormenting was about to reveal capabilities that existed far beyond Morrison's ability to recognize or comprehend. Commander Walsh recognized the signs immediately, her own training allowing her to read the subtle changes in Marcus's posture that indicated a transition from passive endurance to active preparation. The morning's entertainment was about to become something much more serious, though Morrison remained completely unaware of the forces he had set in motion through his spectacular combination of arrogance and poor judgment. The confrontation reached its critical threshold as Morrison stepped within arm's reach of Marcus, his voice rising to a level that bordered on screaming. The gathered crowd had fallen silent except for the distant crack of rifles from other shooting positions, creating an atmosphere thick with tension that seemed to press against everyone present like an approaching thunderstorm. Marcus felt the familiar shift in his nervous system as years of combat training overrode civilian conditioning. The hyper-awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory activated automatically, his peripheral vision expanding to track potential threats while his mind calculated response options with the cold efficiency that came from extensive practice under fire. Morrison's tirade had evolved beyond professional criticism into personal attack, his wounded ego demanding satisfaction through the public humiliation of someone he perceived as defenseless. His face was flushed with the combination of rage and adrenaline that came from finally finding a target he believed could not fight back effectively. Commander Walsh moved closer to the developing situation, her own combat instincts recognizing the signs of imminent escalation. Marcus caught her positioning in his peripheral vision, a subtle communication between veterans who understood how quickly civilian conflicts could transform into something requiring military responses. Emma had pressed herself against Marcus's side, her small body trembling with the instinctive fear that children felt when adult situations moved beyond normal boundaries into genuine danger. Her presence served as both anchor and accelerant, keeping Marcus grounded in protective responsibility while simultaneously activating the deepest levels of his warrior programming. Morrison made his fatal error by reaching out to grab Marcus's shoulder while continuing his verbal assault, apparently believing that physical intimidation would complete the dominance display he had been building throughout the morning. His hand was still 6 inches away when Marcus moved with the fluid precision that separated recreational shooters from combat veterans. The response was so economical and controlled that most observers missed its significance. Marcus simply stepped back and to the side, his movement creating distance while positioning Morrison off balance. The action appeared defensive rather than aggressive, though anyone with military experience recognized the sophisticated footwork that had just neutralized a potential threat. Morrison stumbled slightly, his momentum carrying him forward into empty space where Marcus had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The physical humiliation of his failed intimidation attempt sent his emotional state beyond rational boundaries, his voice rising to a pitch that commanded attention from everyone on the range. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I have been talking about," Morrison shouted, his words carrying across the morning air with the clarity that came from complete loss of emotional control. "This facility employs people who are not qualified to handle basic maintenance, much less understand the needs of serious shooters." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged rifle, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple job performance. Marcus felt something cold and dangerous stir in his chest as Morrison's attack moved from personal harassment to professional sabotage, threatening the employment that provided Emma security and medical care. Commander Walsh stepped forward with the measured authority of someone who had commanded respect in places where hesitation meant death. Her voice cut through Morrison's hysteria with the precision of a surgical instrument, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who would not tolerate further escalation. "That is enough," she said simply, her words possessing the weight that came from years of life-and-death decision-making under pressure. Morrison turned toward her with the wielded aggression of someone whose judgment had been completely compromised by wounded pride and public humiliation. "This man is clearly not qualified to work at a facility that caters to experienced shooters," Morrison continued, his voice maintaining its hysterical pitch despite Commander Walsh's intervention. "His equipment knowledge is obviously inadequate, and his professional competence is questionable at best." Marcus felt years of military discipline warring with protective instincts as Morrison's attack threatened not just his dignity but his ability to provide for Emma. The steady paycheck that covered their rent, her medical appointments, the small stability they had built together since Sarah's death, all of it was being jeopardized by a man whose own incompetence had been thoroughly demonstrated. The crowd of observers had grown larger as word spread about the confrontation unfolding at the far end of the range. Marcus recognized several regular customers among the gathering, people who had witnessed his professional competence and quiet dedication over the past 3 years. Their expressions reflected the same discomfort that came from watching injustice play out in real time. Emma looked up at Marcus with the questioning expression that meant she was trying to understand adult behavior that defied logical explanation. Her trust in his ability to handle any situation was absolute, though she could sense the dangerous currents flowing beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple argument between grown-ups. Commander Walsh's patience had clearly reached its limits as Morrison continued his assault on Marcus's professional qualifications. Her military bearing became more pronounced as she prepared to intervene with the authority that came from decades of command experience in hostile environments. Morrison seemed to interpret the gathering crowd as validation of his position rather than evidence of his own poor judgment. His voice grew more confident as he detailed Marcus's supposed inadequacies, apparently believing that volume and repetition would transform his opinions into accepted facts. Marcus maintained his professional composure despite the familiar surge of combat chemicals flooding his system. Years of civilian employment had taught him the value of choosing battles carefully, but Morrison's attack was threatening the foundation of everything he had built since leaving military service. The morning sun continued its relentless climb, casting everything in harsh clarity that eliminated shadows and revealed character with unforgiving precision. The range had become a stage where multiple dramas were converging toward a resolution that would test everyone's ability to maintain civilized behavior in the face of provocation that exceeded normal boundaries. Morrison's next words would determine whether the situation ended with professional intervention or escalated into something requiring the kind of response that Marcus had hoped never to need in civilian life. Commander Walsh positioned herself where she could act quickly if necessary, her own training allowing her to recognize the signs of a combat veteran being pushed beyond the limits of reasonable tolerance. The gathered crowd sensed that the morning's entertainment was about to transform into something much more serious, though most remained unaware of the true capabilities possessed by the quiet maintenance worker who had been absorbing Morrison's abuse with professional dignity that masked decades of specialized training in places where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. The decisive moment arrived with the sudden clarity that often preceded life-changing events. Commander Walsh stepped forward with the measured authority of someone who had made critical decisions under fire, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone within sight. The morning's chaos seemed to pause as she moved between Morrison and Marcus with the fluid precision that marked decades of special operations experience. Morrison's tirade faltered slightly as he found himself confronting genuine military authority, though his wounded pride prevented him from recognizing the magnitude of his tactical disadvantage. His voice maintained its aggressive edge as he attempted to redirect his attack toward Commander Walsh herself, apparently believing that civilian status meant military credentials could be dismissed or challenged. Marcus watched the interaction unfold with the heightened awareness that came from years of combat deployment. Every muscle in his body remained coiled and ready, though his external appearance projected the same professional calm he had maintained throughout Morrison's escalating harassment. Emma pressed closer to his side, her young instincts recognizing that adult situations were moving beyond her understanding. Commander Walsh reached into her range bag with deliberate movements, her actions drawing the attention of everyone present. Morrison continued his verbal assault, oblivious to the fact that he was about to receive an education in the difference between assumed authority and earned respect. The gathered crowd sensed that something significant was about to unfold, though most remained unaware of its true implications. What emerged from Walsh's bag was a precision rifle that immediately commanded respect from anyone who understood firearms. The weapon was clearly military issue, its configuration speaking to functionality rather than civilian aesthetics. Every component had been selected and modified for maximum effectiveness under combat conditions, creating an instrument that was both beautiful and deadly in its purposeful design. Morrison's voice died completely as Commander Walsh began assembling the rifle with movements that revealed decades of muscle memory developed under pressure. Her hands moved with the unconscious efficiency that came from performing these actions in hostile territory where speed and precision meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The range fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of the rifle being prepared for operation. Marcus recognized the weapon immediately, his own military experience allowing him to appreciate both its capabilities and the expertise required to utilize them effectively. Commander Walsh was not simply demonstrating equipment, she was revealing credentials that could not be purchased or faked. Emma looked up at Marcus with wide eyes, sensing the shift in adult dynamics even if she could not fully comprehend their significance. The quiet maintenance worker she knew as her father was watching the rifle assembly with an intensity that suggested knowledge far beyond his current employment. Something in his posture had changed, becoming more alert and focused than she had ever seen. Morrison attempted to regain control of the situation through increased volume, but his words seemed to bounce off Commander Walsh's concentration without effect. She continued her methodical preparation of the rifle, each movement precise and economical in ways that spoke to extensive combat experience under conditions where mistakes had permanent consequences. The crowd of observers had grown larger as word spread about the confrontation that was evolving into something beyond normal range drama. Marcus noted several veterans among the gathering, their expressions reflecting recognition of what they were witnessing. Commander Walsh was not simply ending an argument, she was providing education in authentic versus assumed competence. Marcus felt years of suppressed memories stirring as he watched the familiar ritual of precision rifle preparation. The weight of a properly configured weapon, the intimate knowledge of ballistics and environmental factors, the zen-like focus that came with perfect sight alignment and breathing control. His civilian facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of professional recognition. Commander Walsh completed her rifle assembly and turned toward Marcus with an expression that seemed to look directly through his carefully maintained civilian persona. Her eyes held the calculating assessment that one combat veteran gave another, recognizing capabilities that existed far beyond current circumstances or employment status. "Chen," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that came from commanding respect in the most dangerous places on Earth. "I need you to check the sight alignment on this weapon." The word seemed simple enough, but Marcus understood immediately that she was offering him something far more significant than a routine maintenance task. The request hung in the air between them like a bridge across 3 years of civilian employment and suppressed identity. Marcus felt Emma's small hand slip into his as she sensed the importance of the moment, though she could not yet understand why her father's entire demeanor was shifting in response to Commander Walsh's simple words. Morrison seemed to recognize that the dynamic had changed in ways beyond his understanding, though his wounded ego prevented him from acknowledging the depth of his disadvantage. His voice carried less conviction as he attempted to maintain his aggressive stance, apparently unaware that he was witnessing the emergence of capabilities that exceeded his ability to recognize or comprehend. Marcus looked down at Emma, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her trusting expression. She believed absolutely in his ability to handle any situation, though she had never seen the side of him that had earned survival in places where hesitation meant death. The decision he made in the next few seconds would determine whether his carefully constructed civilian life could continue or whether circumstances would force him to reveal capabilities he had hoped never to need again. Commander Walsh extended the rifle toward Marcus with movements that suggested she already knew what his response would be. Her military bearing conveyed the unmistakable message that she was not offering equipment for inspection, but rather providing an opportunity for authentic identity to emerge from beneath years of protective concealment. The morning sun had reached its zenith, casting everything in stark relief that eliminated shadows and revealed truth with unforgiving clarity. Marcus felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure before a storm, knowing that his next action would change everything about how the world saw both him and his daughter. Emma squeezed his hand gently, her gesture conveying absolute trust in whatever choice he made. Morrison continued his diminished protests from a safe distance, apparently sensing that the situation had moved beyond his ability to influence or control. The gathered crowd waited with the anticipation that came from witnessing moments when carefully maintained facades were about to crumble under the pressure of authentic revelation. Marcus reached toward the offered rifle with hands that remembered capabilities he had spent 3 years trying to forget, knowing that accepting Commander Walsh's challenge would end the quiet anonymity that had protected Emma from the complexities of his past. But Morrison's threat to his employment had left him with no choice except to reveal qualifications that existed far beyond civilian comprehension. Marcus accepted the rifle from Commander Walsh with hands that remembered capabilities he had spent 3 years trying to forget. The weapon felt familiar in ways that transcended rational thought, its weight and balance triggering muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of training under conditions where precision meant survival. The civilian facade he had carefully maintained began to dissolve as authentic identity emerged from beneath years of protective concealment. Emma watched with wide eyes as her father's entire demeanor transformed in response to holding the precision rifle. The quiet maintenance worker she knew disappeared, replaced by someone whose movements carried the fluid confidence that came from extensive combat experience. She sensed that she was witnessing something important about her father that had remained hidden until this moment. The gathered crowd fell silent as Marcus began his inspection of the rifle with movements that revealed professional expertise far beyond his current employment. His hands moved with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had performed these actions countless times under pressure, checking components and adjustments with the systematic thoroughness that separated recreational shooters from combat veterans. Morrison attempted to regain control of the situation through renewed verbal aggression, but his words seemed to bounce off the concentrated focus that surrounded Marcus and Commander Walsh. The dynamic had shifted beyond civilian harassment into territory where authentic credentials would determine outcomes rather than volume or assumed authority. Marcus completed his initial inspection of the rifle and moved toward the shooting position with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in that environment. His civilian clothing could not disguise the military bearing that emerged as he prepared to demonstrate capabilities that existed far beyond Morrison's ability to recognize or comprehend. Commander Walsh positioned herself where she could observe both Marcus's technique and the crowd's reaction to what was about to unfold. Her expression remained neutral, though Marcus caught the slight nod that indicated professional recognition between combat veterans who understood each other despite different service branches and current circumstances. The range had become completely silent except for the distant crack of rifles from other shooting positions as word spread about the demonstration that was about to take place. Marcus noted several veterans among the gathered observers, their expressions reflecting the same anticipation that came from witnessing authentic competence preparing to emerge from careful concealment. Marcus settled into his shooting position with movements that flowed like water, his body automatically assuming the perfect stance that had been drilled into him through endless repetition under hostile conditions. The transformation was so complete that Emma barely recognized the man she had known as her gentle father, though she felt no fear at witnessing this new side of his identity. The rifle came to his shoulder with the natural ease that marked decades of specialized training, his breathing automatically adjusting to the rhythm that would provide the stable platform necessary for precision shooting. Morrison's earlier demonstration had revealed the difference between expensive equipment and authentic expertise, but Marcus was about to display capabilities that existed in an entirely different category. Commander Walsh called out the range conditions in a voice that carried across the morning air with military precision. Wind speed and direction, temperature, atmospheric pressure, all the environmental factors that affected long-range shooting delivered with the expertise of someone who had made similar calculations under combat conditions where failure meant mission compromise or personnel loss. Marcus absorbed the information with the unconscious processing that came from years of making ballistic calculations under pressure. His mind automatically compensated for environmental variables while his body maintained the perfect stillness that would allow the rifle to perform to its designed capabilities. The civilian maintenance worker had completely disappeared, replaced by a precision instrument calibrated for effectiveness. The target at the far end of the range appeared impossibly small through the rifle scope, a challenge that would have defeated most recreational shooters even under optimal conditions. Marcus studied the distant paper with the patient focus that had once made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure in places where second chances did not exist. Emma moved closer to Commander Walsh, instinctively seeking the protection of another adult while her father prepared to do something that clearly required his complete attention. The commander's hand settled gently on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance from someone who understood the complexity of having a parent whose capabilities extended far beyond normal civilian boundaries. Morrison's voice had faded to insignificant background noise as the gathered crowd focused their attention on the quiet demonstration of authentic competence that was about to unfold. His expensive equipment and assumed authority seemed suddenly irrelevant when confronted with the real thing, though his wounded ego prevented him from recognizing the magnitude of his disadvantage. Marcus's breathing settled into the natural rhythm that provided perfect stability between heartbeats, his entire being focused on the precise coordination of sight alignment and trigger control that would send the bullet exactly where intended. The morning sun eliminated shadows and wind conditions were optimal, creating the perfect environment for a demonstration of capabilities that few civilians ever witnessed. The range held its collective breath as Marcus prepared to fire, the tension palpable among observers who sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Commander Walsh watched with the professional interest of someone who had seen elite marksmanship under combat conditions, her expression suggesting she already knew what the result would be. Marcus felt the familiar zen-like state that came with perfect shot preparation, his mind clear of everything except the essential elements that would determine success or failure. The target, the crosshairs, the natural respiratory pause, the smooth press of a trigger that would break like glass under controlled pressure. The shot broke with the surgical precision that marked true expertise, the rifle's report echoing across the range with authority that commanded respect from everyone present. Marcus maintained his position for several seconds after firing, his follow-through perfect as he observed the bullet's impact through the rifle scope. Commander Walsh raised her binoculars to confirm what Marcus had already seen through his scope, her professional assessment delivered with the crisp authority that came from years of evaluating combat performance under pressure. The result would silence Morrison's criticism and reveal capabilities that existed far beyond civilian comprehension. Emma watched her father with a mixture of amazement and recognition, sensing that she was witnessing the emergence of someone who had always existed beneath the surface of the gentle maintenance worker she had known. The morning's drama was about to reach its resolution through a demonstration of authentic expertise that would transform everyone's understanding of who Marcus Chun really was. The bullet found its mark with surgical precision that defied the laws of probability and civilian expectation. Through the rifle scope, Marcus observed the perfect center hit on a target that most recreational shooters would consider impossible under any conditions. The shot had been executed with the flawless technique that came from thousands of hours of training under hostile fire, where the difference between precision and approximation meant survival or death. Commander Walsh lowered her binoculars with the satisfied expression of someone whose professional assessment had been confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. "Perfect center," she announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the authority that came from decades of evaluating combat performance under pressure. The shot had been executed at a distance and under conditions that separated elite marksmen from recreational shooters. The range erupted in stunned silence that lasted several heartbeats before evolving into amazed murmurs as the gathered observers processed what they had witnessed. Marcus remained in his shooting position for several seconds, his follow-through perfect as years of ingrained discipline overrode the civilian impulse to immediately check results or celebrate success. Morrison's face cycled through several expressions as the reality of what had occurred penetrated his wounded pride and shattered assumptions. The maintenance worker he had been tormenting with such confidence had just demonstrated capabilities that existed far beyond anything Morrison could recognize or comprehend. His expensive equipment and assumed authority seemed suddenly ridiculous when confronted with authentic expertise. Marcus finally rose from his shooting position with the fluid movements that marked decades of specialized training, his transformation from civilian maintenance worker to combat veteran now complete and visible to everyone present. He handed the rifle back to Commander Walsh with the respectful precision that one professional showed another, their silent communication reflecting mutual recognition and respect. Emma ran to her father's side with the unbridled excitement that came from witnessing something amazing, though she did not yet fully understand the implications of what had just occurred. "Dad, that was incredible," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the pure joy that children brought to moments of adult achievement. Marcus knelt down to her level, his gentle smile returning as he focused on what truly mattered. The crowd began to stir with renewed energy as the full impact of Marcus's demonstration settled into their understanding. Several veterans approached with the respectful recognition that combat soldiers showed toward acknowledged expertise, their expressions reflecting the same professional assessment that Commander Walsh had made moments earlier. Morrison attempted to salvage some fragment of his damaged credibility through renewed criticism, but his words carried no weight when delivered in the aftermath of such a devastating display of authentic competence. His companions had completed their strategic withdrawal, leaving him isolated with his wounded pride and shattered assumptions about hierarchy and authority. Commander Walsh stepped forward with the measured authority of someone who was about to reveal information that would reshape everyone's understanding of the morning's events. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the gathered crowd, "you have just witnessed marksmanship from Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chen, United States Marine Corps, recipient of 2 Bronze Stars and holder of the Marine Corps record for long-range precision shooting." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical force, transforming their understanding of everything that had occurred during the morning's confrontation. The quiet maintenance worker who had been absorbing Morrison's abuse with professional dignity was revealed as one of the most decorated marksmen in Marine Corps history, someone whose credentials were earned in places where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. Morrison's face went through several additional color changes as the magnitude of his tactical error became apparent to everyone present, including himself. He had been attempting to humiliate someone whose qualifications exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude, someone who had been showing restraint rather than revealing incompetence throughout their entire interaction. Marcus maintained his humble demeanor despite the crowd's obvious amazement, his focus remaining on Emma rather than the adult recognition that surrounded them. Years of civilian employment had taught him the value of quiet dignity over public display, though circumstances had forced him to reveal capabilities he had hoped to keep hidden for his daughter's protection. "If this story has touched your heart," Commander Walsh continued, addressing not just the immediate crowd but somehow sensing a larger audience beyond the range, "let us know where you are listening from and remember that heroes often walk among us unrecognized, serving quietly in whatever capacity allows them to care for those they love most." Emma looked up at her father with new understanding dawning in her eyes, though her love and trust remained unchanged by the revelation of his hidden past. She had always known he was special, though she was beginning to comprehend that other people were just now discovering what she had felt instinctively throughout her young life. The aftermath of Marcus's demonstration created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate shooting range community. Word would spread about the decorated Marine who worked maintenance to provide for his daughter, someone who had chosen quiet service over public recognition in pursuit of the stability that Emma's security required. Morrison made one final attempt to assert some form of authority, but his words fell on deaf ears as the crowd's attention remained focused on the authentic hero who had been revealed through his own spectacular misjudgment. Commander Walsh's revelation had transformed Marcus from invisible maintenance worker to recognized elite warrior, though his priorities remained unchanged. Marcus stood with Emma at his side, accepting the congratulations and recognition that flowed toward them from the gathered crowd of shooting enthusiasts and veterans. His demonstration had ended Morrison's harassment permanently while revealing capabilities that commanded respect from anyone who understood the difference between purchased equipment and earned expertise. Commander Walsh approached Marcus with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision that would change multiple lives. "Gunnery Sergeant Chen," she said formally, "I believe we need to discuss your future employment opportunities at this facility." Her words carried implications that extended far beyond simple job security into possibilities that Marcus had not dared to consider. The morning sun had reached its full intensity, casting everything in brilliant clarity that revealed truth and eliminated the shadows where deception and false authority could hide. Marcus felt years of careful concealment falling away as his authentic identity emerged into daylight, though his protective love for Emma remained the driving force behind every decision he would make. Morrison's retreat was as complete as his earlier confidence had been absolute, his expensive equipment abandoned as he sought escape from a situation that had revealed his inadequacies to everyone present. The morning's entertainment had become education in the difference between assumed competence and authentic capability, delivered with the surgical precision that marked true expertise. Emma squeezed her father's hand as the crowd continued to gather around them, her young wisdom recognizing that their lives had just changed in ways that would take time to fully understand. But her trust in Marcus remained absolute, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together with the same quiet strength that had carried them through every challenge since her mother's death. 3 months after the morning that changed everything, Marcus stood in his new office overlooking the expanded training facility that had become the premier destination for serious marksmen throughout the region. The transformation from maintenance worker to director of training and veteran programs had happened with the same precision that marked everything Commander Walsh undertook, each step carefully planned and executed with military efficiency. Emma sat at a small desk in the corner of the office, her homework spread before her as she worked through mathematics problems with the focused concentration that had always made Marcus proud. The expensive hearing specialist appointments were no longer a source of financial stress, and her test results had shown significant improvement with proper treatment that was now easily affordable. The morning sun streamed through windows that looked out over ranges where veterans found purpose and civilians learned respect for authentic expertise. Marcus had designed the training programs to bridge the gap between recreational shooting and professional competence, creating an environment where knowledge was shared rather than hoarded and respect was earned through demonstration rather than assumption. Commander Walsh appeared in the doorway with the punctual efficiency that marked all her movements, a stack of applications in her hand from veterans seeking positions at the facility. The program Marcus had developed for transitioning military personnel had attracted attention from across the country, creating opportunities for men and women whose specialized skills deserved recognition and employment. The partnership that had emerged from that confrontational morning had proven beneficial beyond anyone's expectations. Marcus brought combat expertise and training capability, while Commander Walsh provided business acumen and the vision to expand their mission beyond simple recreational shooting into something that served the broader veteran community. Emma looked up from her homework as Commander Walsh entered, her smile reflecting the comfortable relationship that had developed between them over the past months. The commander had become something approaching family, someone whose presence provided additional security and stability in their lives without threatening the bond between father and daughter. Morrison had disappeared completely from their world, his business interests apparently taking him to other regions where his reputation had not preceded him. Occasionally Marcus wondered what lessons the man had learned from his spectacular humiliation, though he invested little mental energy in someone whose poor judgment had created opportunities rather than lasting problems. The phone rang with the frequency that had become normal since word spread about the facility's transformation under Marcus's leadership. Military units seeking advanced training, law enforcement agencies requiring specialized instruction, and individual veterans looking for community and purpose all contributed to a schedule that remained busy but manageable. Marcus answered the call with the professional courtesy that had become second nature, though his eyes remained focused on Emma as she worked through her assignments. The conversation involved coordination with a Marine unit seeking refresher training, the kind of work that allowed him to serve his former brothers while building something lasting for his daughter's future. After completing the call, Marcus turned his attention to the training schedule that Commander Walsh had prepared for the following week. The roster included a mixture of military personnel, law enforcement officers, and carefully selected civilians who had demonstrated both competence and proper attitude toward firearms training and safety. Emma finished her homework and approached Marcus's desk with the quiet confidence that had grown stronger over the past months. "Dad," she said, looking up at him with eyes that reflected understanding beyond her years, "I am proud of what you do here." Her words carried weight that surprised him, though he had learned to recognize the wisdom that children sometimes possessed about essential truths. The transformation in their lives had been profound but carefully managed to preserve the stability that Emma required. Marcus had insisted on maintaining the same apartment and routines that provided continuity, though financial stress was no longer a constant presence in their daily existence. Commander Walsh reviewed the applications with the thorough attention she brought to all personnel decisions, her military experience allowing her to identify candidates whose skills and character would contribute to the facility's mission. Each hiring decision reflected their shared commitment to creating opportunities for veterans while maintaining the highest standards of professionalism. The afternoon brought a visit from a group of Marine officers who had heard about Marcus's programs and wanted to evaluate potential partnerships with their training command. The recognition from his former service branch represented validation of the path he had chosen, though his primary satisfaction came from the daily knowledge that he was building something meaningful for Emma's future. Emma spent the afternoon reading in the comfortable chair Marcus had placed near his desk, her presence serving as both anchor and inspiration for the work he performed. The quiet companionship they shared had deepened over the months, strengthened by the elimination of financial stress and the pride that came from meaningful employment. As evening approached, Marcus prepared to close the facility and return home to their small apartment, though he knew that changes were coming that would soon require decisions about their living situation. Commander Walsh had suggested that the facility's growth warranted on-site housing for key personnel, creating opportunities for expanded programs and enhanced security. The drive home took them past the original shooting range where everything had begun, though Marcus rarely looked back with anything other than gratitude for the chain of events that had led to their current circumstances. Morrison's harassment had forced him to reveal capabilities he had hidden, creating opportunities that would never have emerged through continued concealment. Emma asked questions about the day's activities with the engaged curiosity that had become her trademark, her understanding of the facility's mission growing more sophisticated as she observed the positive impact on veterans who found purpose and community through the training programs Marcus had developed. Their evening routine remained unchanged despite the transformation in their circumstances, Marcus believing that stability in small things provided the foundation for navigating larger changes successfully. Emma's bedtime stories now included tales of the heroes who had emerged from quiet service, though the essential message remained focused on character rather than recognition. As Emma settled into sleep, Marcus reflected on the morning that had changed everything and the recognition that authentic worth would always emerge when circumstances demanded its revelation. The quiet maintenance worker had disappeared, replaced by someone whose capabilities served a larger purpose while maintaining the protective love that remained his primary mission. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that had seemed impossible during the years of careful concealment, though Marcus knew that Emma's well-being would continue to guide every decision he made. The shooting range had become more than a business, evolving into a community where authentic expertise was recognized and veterans found the respect their service had earned. Commander Walsh had been right about the power of authentic recognition to transform lives and create opportunities that served purposes larger than individual advancement. Marcus fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve others while building something lasting for the daughter whose love had sustained him through every difficulty they had faced together.